Hey guys, I'm excited today. I have with me Jan Holden. Um, she's done a lot of research and has a lot of titles, so I'll just kind of let her introduce herself. I don't want to slaughter her everything.
Thanks, Kendall. I don't think you'd slaughter it, but I'm happy to introduce myself. I have a Doctor of Education degree in counselor education. So I got a master's and doctorate in counseling and was on faculty at the University of North Texas teaching counseling from 1988 through 2019. So 31 years. And then I retired from the university in 2019. And since then, I've remained very professionally active. And most significantly, I guess, I've been serving as president of the International Association for Near-Death Studies. And that's because a professor's job actually has three parts. Teaching is only a third of it. A third is service, and then the other third is research. And my research, all those 3 decades, was on the counseling implications of near-death experiences, after-death communication, what the whole gamut of what I call transpersonal experiences. And so that involved not only how these kinds of issues are addressed in counseling, but counseling is based in a philosophy of the mind, and so the implications of these kinds of experiences. Excuse me. Yeah, the implications of these kinds of experiences for the relationship between mind and brain, and what that means about how we see ourselves and how we see our clients and humanity and purpose in life and all of that. So it touches on everything from the moments of interaction in the counseling session all the way to big picture questions about life and death and purpose.
Yeah, that's great. That's amazing. Obviously, I'm all very interested in that. And yeah, I've been wanting to have a episode for a while on the relationship between mental health and mental illness and awakening, or whatever language you want to use to call it, and maybe the overlap or differences. And then I heard about you and that you've kind of studied this, and so I was like, you would be the perfect guest. So I'm really excited. How did you get into this work from being a counselor? How do you have a personal story that kind of got you interested, or maybe clients that have had these experiences and you're like, oh, I need education in this? Or how did that work out?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of a long story, but uh, first of all, just as a preteen and teenager, I was interested in phenomena that couldn't be easily explained. So I studied Edgar Cayce and
Oh yeah,
things
me
like
too.
that, mysticism and all that sort of thing. Um, and then when I think it was the summer between my sophomore and junior year of my undergraduate work, I was at home for the summer, and my father had read a book called The Great Soul Trial, and he gave it to me to read. And it's a nonfiction book about a reclusive miner from Arizona who, in the late 1960s, he lived a very ascetic life, just a little room in some city in Arizona, and he would go off doing mining expeditions in the mountains for 2 or 3 months, and then he'd come back, go to the bank with whatever he had mined, and got new provisions, and then disappeared again for another couple of months. Well, one day he went off and he never came back. So 7 years later, the state of Arizona declared him dead, and they opened his safe deposit box, and there they found several $100,000, which was more money then than it is now, with a handwritten note that he wanted the money used for research on the survival of the human soul after death. So the state of Arizona did what they had to. They put a little notice in the paper, and they figured they ran it for a week and as required, and figured nobody would pay any attention to it. But over 100 individuals and organizations came forward to try to claim the money. So the state of Arizona had to actually put on a trial where a judge heard all these people testify how they would use the money
Wow.
to research this question. So a lot of the book is transcripts from the court records of people like the research director from the American Society for Psychical Research, the research director from the Psychical Research Foundation, testifying how they would use this money. And there's a longer story that's really interesting with a very ironic twist and all that, but I won't go into that. Just to say that this book I now consider really to have been the most important, the most influential book of my life,
Mm,
because it opened, at the time I was at college, I was studying psychology, and the whole thing then was behaviorism, which is just the
mm,
complete
right.
opposite of
Skinner.
transpersonal. Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly.
Mhm.
Skinner and Pavlov and all that. But this book opened my mind to how a question that was very interesting to me about the survival of consciousness after death might be researched in a scientific manner.
Mm,
So then, fast forward, that was probably around 1970, and fast forward to about the middle of mid 1980s. I was finishing my doctoral degree in counseling, and it was time to do my dissertation. And long story short, I started 5 different projects, each of which awarded, so
it
I'd
sounds
start
like me. So
another
many
one.
interests.
And finally, I decided to try a study related to near death experiences.
Mm.
And I now think that the angels were sort of watching and saying, okay, now she's on number 3. We'll wait for that one too. Now she's on okay, finally she's on one that we can support. And that's the one that went all the way
Mm,
through and finished my doctoral degree. Well,
mm,
I was absolutely, a lot of people, when they do a dissertation, they get sick of the subject because you have to be
mhm,
so, careful in everything you do. It just becomes,
mhm,
ugh. But I was just the opposite. I was enthralled, and I continue to be. Like,
mhm,
one of the perks of being a member of the International Association for Near Death Studies is that about once a month appears in your email box what we call the monthly NDE. And it's an NDE that one of our volunteers chooses from our archives to highlight because of some interesting features. When I see that email, even now, after all these years that I have interviewed, heard, read, like probably thousands of near death
mhm.
experiences, when I see that, I practically always drop everything and open that email and read it. I'm still enthralled to hear people's stories. So, so it's been amazing. And I've had several transpersonal experiences myself over the years. Starting in adolescence, I had one experience, but then really more early adulthood, they started happening much more. And I've had after death communication,
Mm,
mystical experiences, a lot of precognition, a lot of deja vu,
mm.
and past life memories. So, I've
Wow.
had lots of
Mhm.
experience in the transpersonal domain myself.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing. Yeah, about I've talked about my own experience in a near death experience book. It was by PMH Atwater. She's a
Yeah.
she's a trip. But
Yes, she
yeah,
is.
I appreciate her research. But it related a lot to my own awakening and kind of helped me get into it and get into the spiritual journey and figure out things. And a while back, I used to, what was the website called? But basically, they had a bunch of near death experience accounts, and people would tell their story. And I used to read one a day. And yeah, there's something about them. They just fill me with this light and love and a peace. And it's not even the I mean, it is the intellectual, but it's more about just how it makes me feel and that connection to God and the spiritual. So I totally understand what you're saying. It's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. I still just draw so much inspiration from them too. So they're great. Yeah.
Yeah. So I had a question. So your own experiences, do you think that they, and this is my question I have with myself, maybe it's a combination. Is it something that you feel like you did yourself to spur on these experiences, or is it something that just happened to you, or maybe kind of in between?
Yeah, I would say in my case, they're almost all completely spontaneous and unanticipated.
Mm.
And I'm ashamed to say I'm a total failure in meditation. I'm just too lazy or too busy. I don't want to take the time to meditate, but it doesn't
Mhm.
seem to have, the absence of meditation doesn't seem to have interfered with my
There's hope
having
for other people.
lots.
They'll be
Yeah,
glad to hear that.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, meditation, I'm sure, absolutely facilitates experiences like this, but it definitely isn't
Mm,
necessary. They
mm,
happen to, people all around the world. We just know a lot about these experiences being very ubiquitous. So,
mhm.
yeah. So, I did I answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. A follow-up question. I grew up Christian, and so whenever I had my awakening, it was very hard to reconcile what I understood about that. Did you grow up religious, and did your experiences and research, how did that interact with each other?
Yeah. I did grow up in the liberal branch of the Lutheran Church
Hmm.
and was, went to services in Sunday school and all that stuff on a very regular basis until I was, I think, 17. And I couldn't reconcile the hypocrisy of my mother taking us to church every week, but then treating us really psychologically
Mm.
abusively.
Oh,
So
no.
the only way I knew to deal with that was to say, I'm not going to church anymore.
Right.
So I left Christianity, and I really, I think, kind of scapegoated the church, like took it
Mm.
out on the church. But I really should have held my mother more responsible, although I did
Mm.
hold her responsible as well.
Mhm.
And so that by the time I was like reading about near death experiences, or reading that book I mentioned, and then in 78, I read Raymond Moody's book
Oh
Life
yeah,
After
ready.
Life, which
Mhm.
is it was
Mhm.
published in 75. I was a little slow on the uptake, but it's his book about near death experiences that I now say, after all the years of research that everybody has done as a follow up to that book that opened the field of near death studies, the way to summarize the results of all that research is to say what he said in that first book. It was just it's been
Mhm.
very, almost all of it has been just substantiated by further
Mhm.
research. So, so I forgot where I was going.
Oh yeah, just your relations with religion and then
Oh
that
yeah,
interaction
right.
with.
So
Mhm.
by the time I was um, delving into these phenomena, I will say that another thing that helped me move in this direction was in my graduate school at Northern Illinois University, in the counseling program there. It wasn't in the counseling program, but it was in the College of Education that the program was part of. There was a course called um, Transpersonal Perspective in Education and Counseling.
Hmm.
And I had finished my master's degree in counseling, and I was burned out. I was vowing never to take another class again. And then this was back in the days when they actually sent the catalog to
Mm.
your home in hard
Mhm.
copy. And it had been maybe a year since I'd finished, and I was just leafing through, and I saw this course. And I thought, that would just be fun to take. It sounds like really interesting. Well, it got me launched into my doctoral degree, and on the faculty there in my counseling program was a faculty member who was transpersonally oriented. So I took a course in psychosynthesis and other courses related to the transpersonal domain. So that all helped. And as I said, by that time I wasn't religiously affiliated. So I still consider myself to absolutely subscribe to Christian ethics and that sort of thing. But I haven't been affiliated with the church, for decades.
Okay. Got it. Yeah. Thanks.
But your comment about reconciling your faith with your experiences is a real common aspect of spiritual awakening, or what I'll be talking about as spiritual emergence.
I'm just going to keep asking you questions. We'll never get there. Things just keep coming to mind. One thing I was in grad school for a while for counseling, and it was just interesting to me. So of course there's a part of psychology and psychologists that are interested in this transpersonal psychology, and maybe existential kind of touches on that, and the spiritual part. And I'm a big fan of Jung. We've talked about him before on the podcast, and he was definitely into that. How does that jive with mainstream psychology? Are they interested, or is that accepted, or is it kind of like, oh, you're the ugly stepchild, we're going to hide in the basement, or we're not sure about those other people that are into that? How do they view that?
Yeah, well, I think there are several perspectives going on. One is the probably the most important one is that every branch of psychotherapy organization has or every psychotherapy organization has a branch that addresses spirituality in counseling and includes attention to the transpersonal domain. And maybe I'll talk about those two words, spiritual and transpersonal, here in a minute.
Sure.
But so, for example, in the American Counseling Association has the Association for Spiritual, Ethical, and Religious Values in Counseling, ASERVIC, and that's the main area where this is addressed. In the American Psychological Association, there is a transpersonal shoot off group, offshoot group. So there is official recognition of these phenomena. And a few years ago, the American Psychological Association published a book called The Varieties of Anomalous Experience that included chapters on mystical experience, near-death experience, and psychic phenomena and things like that. So there's been, very official attention to these topics. At the same time, the reality is that right now, philosophical materialism or physicalism dominates science, and that leaks into the medical and helping professions. And so some people look kind of askance on these topics, despite the fact that there is so much research on these experiences and their beneficial effects that and how people, I actually did a study of near-death experiencers who had been in counseling and talked about their near-death experience in counseling. And a third of them reported that they felt psychologically harmed by the way their counselor responded to them. And, the counselor didn't recognize what they were describing as a near-death experience, they would try to explain it away as a hallucination or a drug effect or something like that. They would pathologize the person, the experience, or the person, sometimes even diagnosing people with mental disorder. And they would demonize the experience and perceive it as somehow spiritually evil. Research shows that every one of those reactions is not supported by research. So, in other words, NDEs are a thing that need to be acknowledged. They cannot be explained by things like hallucination, drug effects, and stuff like that. They are not associated with psychopathology, and they are not associated with psychospiritual damage. Just the opposite. People become more spiritual in that they become like less materialistic, more passionate, more concerned about others, and anything that by any definition would fit the idea of spiritual development. So, but that information hasn't filtered down to the front lines in a lot of the helping professions. So this is one of my, like, don't get me started things.
That's what this is all about.
Yeah, that's what this is all about. We're trying to get the word out so that people can be, because just the opposite of being harmed, if someone is responded to in a helpful way where, that the experience is recognized, it's acknowledged for being potentially real, it's not pathologized, not demonized, the opportunity for the person to process the experience expands their spiritual development. So there's a lot of good that can be done if it's addressed properly, and harm that can be done if it's not. So that's all part of my.
Yeah, that's great. Well, let's just get into it. So how did you, after doing your doctorate on near-death experiences, how did you get into your study on spiritual emergence or spiritual emergency and awakening?
Yeah, well, it was just kind of an inevitability because it's part of the whole transpersonal literature. So as I was reading and developing my, knowledge base, I came across this concept. And I will say, because this is going to come into play in a minute, one of the books I was reading about NDEs was Ken Ring's book, Heading Toward Omega, which is about the after effects of near-death experiences.
Right.
And so I was reading it just with absolute rapt attention until I got to this chapter near the end where he talks about some K thing that I never heard, starts with the letter K, that I never heard about, and how it might be involved in. And I'm like, whatever. And I kind of went whoop, whoop, whoop through those pages. And then the next chapter was once again back on the subject of the actual NDE after effects. Well, so I don't know what year that was, but it was probably around 1988. And around 1990, one day I did I live in the Dallas area, Dallas, Texas. And one of the things I learned about and had a little introduction to in my graduate work was holotropic breath work, which is Stanislav and Christina Groff's approach, non-drug approach to facilitate the same kinds of experiences as people have under LSD. So it was a weekend workshop, and so I was the breather, I was the sitter. If you know anything about what these, I sat with someone else while they breathed, and then they sat with me while I breathed, and then and there was discussion. They had some books for sale, so I bought a few books. That when I got in the car to drive home Sunday evening, I did something that I now realize was not very smart. I had, during my breathwork session, there had been some music playing, and I asked my guy, what was that music? And he said it was the soundtrack to the movie The Mission. And he had it for sale there on a CD. So I bought it, and as I got in the car to go home on Sunday night, I popped it into my CD player. Well, the music is so, I'm just getting chills right now, just remembering what the music is like.
Mhm.
And it's so ethereal and just spiritual. There,
Mhm.
at one point, the music went, and suddenly in the middle of my back comes this pounding sensation that just pounds left and right up my back and up into my head.
Mhm.
And I'm like, what is I'm on the expressway
Oh,
driving.
man.
This is all happening. This is amazing. You can have a Kundalini awakening while driving. And
Please don't.
yeah. And so my first thought was to try to suppress it. So I'm like doing this
Mhm.
kind of imagery thing, immediately got this crushing headache.
Oh,
So
man.
I did just the opposite and imagined the top of my head opening so
Mhm.
that this could just like flow through me. The
Right.
headache went away within a minute. And then, and this force um, uh, went from boom, boom, boom up my back into this
Mhm.
like power surge, just
Mhm.
surging up my back every like 20 to 40 seconds, I would say. And meanwhile, my hands and feet got just incredibly hot.
Right.
Um, and 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 just this sense of my entire body being energized, and it was it and I had no idea what the, pardon my French, was going on. So I got home, and when I walked in, my husband was watching TV, got to a commercial. He, muted it. Well, how was your day? I'm like, well, it was good, but this weird thing is happening. He's a psychologist.
Mhm.
And so I tell him about it. And he said, well, it sounds like something to just kind of stay with and wait and see what happens. And then he turned the TV back on. I was kind of like, this is easy for you to say. But then I remembered somehow I made the association with this K thing that Ring had talked about in that book.
Mhm.
Well, it so happened at this weekend, I had bought Stanislav and Christina Groff's book, Spiritual Emergency.
Hmm.
So I went out to my car, got the book, brought it in, went to the index, went to the K's, started going down the list. And then I saw this word Kundalini in these
Mm.
pages. And I went there and started reading. It's like, oh my God, this is what's happening to me. I'm
Mhm.
having a Kundalini awakening. And it was absolutely, facilitated by the breath work
Mm.
session,
Right.
yeah. And so um, long story short, for me, I did, and they did in the book. They said kind of what my husband said: just let it be and see what happens, and protect yourself from stress, and and so for me, over the course of the next few weeks, these energy surge things just became more spaced out, and until they were only happening like once or twice a day. And then they stopped, except like, for example, when I teach my course on the transpersonal perspective in counseling, and we're having discussions and things like that, sometimes I get Kundalini surges then.
Mhm.
Other kind of transpersonally associated situations, I sometimes get that again.
Mhm.
For me,
If
it
you
just,
meditated, you might feel it then
I
too.
know,
I do it sometimes.
yeah, I'm sure that's, yeah. And I'm a little curious about that, but I don't know. Yeah. So anyway, so that's how I got into really appreciating the concept of spiritual emergence and
Mhm.
emergency. And I do want to say something about the word spiritual and transpersonal.
Right.
I'm going to use the word spiritual a lot, but I
Mhm.
just want to acknowledge that some people don't consider their experiences to be spiritual per
Mhm.
se. And and I've had some people be really put off by the use of that word to refer to their experience. So I'm going to apologize in advance if that happens for anybody here. But that's why I personally prefer the term transpersonal, because it neutrally
Mm.
describes what the key feature of all these types of experiences, which is that the experiencer in some way transcends, that's where the trans part comes in, transcends the usual personal limits of space, time, identity, or influence. And so in that happens in precognition. You're transcending the usual limits of time because you can't normally know what's going to happen in the future, or mystical experience transcending space. After death communication, transcending space. You're not usually in the same space as, dead people. And so that's my favored word, but I do sometimes use spiritual because it's pretty pervasive in the literature. And I don't think when people use it that they mean to conjure up references to like religiosity or things like that. It's more like the domain of spirit, which is like as opposed to the domain of the material world.
Right. So. Yeah, I can understand how people have triggers to certain things, and that makes sense. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. So, would you like me to launch into a little mini lecture about the spiritual emergence?
Yeah, definitely go for it.
So, the terms spiritual emergence and emergency are related. Spiritual emergence is when spiritual material emerges in a person's life in a form and force that the person can easily, or at least reasonably easily, manage. And so, for example, my Kundalini awakening, I would say, was a spiritual emergence. There was something definitely happening there, but it didn't overwhelm me or make me unable to function or anything like that. And so if you just change the word emergence to emergency, that's when the form and force of the material is greater than the person has the capacity to cope with. And so they feel either psychologically overwhelmed or their functioning is impaired, or maybe both. And so it's the emergency is the one that tends to require immediate attention if somebody's psychologically or physically not functioning well. And so spiritual emergency can take any of a number of forms with a lot of different possible symptoms. I know in your awakening, you said that you felt a lot of shaking, and there is this experience that some people have of Kundalini with energy surging up the spine and heat. There can be visions. There can be hearing voices that are talking about spiritual things. And there can be like high energy that makes it possible to concentrate for long periods of time, longer than usual, maybe decreased eating, decreased sleeping.
Guilty.
Yeah. And I think anybody who's experienced spiritual emergency can relate to one or more of those kinds of symptoms. And so I know in your case, you were diagnosed with bipolar, and your episode was labeled a manic episode. And it's a big topic in this whole domain of spiritual emergence and emergence, especially emergency, is what's called differential diagnosis. How do we diagnose spiritual emergency from psychosis, which bipolar is a form of, mental disorder? And so maybe I should say it that way, spiritual emergency from mental disorder of any kind. And and it's a tricky question because at the front end, there can be a lot of overlap of symptoms, like, in your case, the long periods of reading, eating less, sleeping less, energized, and very focused on spiritual kinds of matters and things like that, and hearing a voice, as you did. That all can sound like mania, but there are some important differentiating factors. And before I get into those, let me explain why it's important to differentiate. So I'm a devotee of Ken Wilber's integral psychology. And he divides human development into three main phases or stages. Pre-personal, which is our functioning from birth to age 7, approximately. Personal, starting at 7 and going up at least to 18, but or 21, could be many people stay in the personal level all their life. And the transpersonal level, the potential begins around age 21 to launch into that.
Would that be correlating with the development of the prefrontal cortex?
Well, he doesn't say that, but I think that's a possibility. That because they say, we don't really reach complete maturity until like the early 20s and things like that. So yeah, because at age 7, there's this very recognized shift in developmental psychology between non-rational thinking prior to that age and the emergence of rational thinking. Like try to explain, we'll go to grandma's in a week to a 4-year-old. They just don't have the concept.
Right, the time ahead, yeah.
That whole time and reasoning, they just can't do it. But an 8-year-old can. So the pre-personal stage is dominated by pre-rational thinking. And pre-rational thinking is not logical. It's non-rational. Okay, then around age 7, we develop this capacity for rational thinking, and that begins to dominate our functioning. We think rationally. Well, in the transrational domain, the potential starts around age 21. But I should hasten to say, anybody can have a transpersonal experience at any age. It's about whether your functioning, your holistic functioning is really oriented around one of these ways of pre-rational, rational, or transrational thinking. And transrational thinking is also non-rational.
Right. I'm sure it often gets confused by the rational with the pre-rational.
Exactly. And that's what Wilber calls the pre-trans fallacy. When somebody looks at a transpersonal experience and mistakenly, because it's non-rational, categorizes it as pre-rational. The reason it's so important to make that differentiation is that the way to respond to these, the pre-rational experience, which is characteristic of psychosis, that's where the person really does not have the capacity to exercise rationality, and they're victim to their brain functioning in a way that causes them to be non-rational. That requires a protective environment, medication, and monitoring, and those sorts of things that help the person to get stabilized and gain or regain their rational functioning. If somebody has a transpersonal experience, we call those pre-rational experiences regressive, because the person's going backwards kind of developmentally into a pre-rational state when they're in like a psychotic episode, let's say. But for somebody having a transrational experience, that's what we call a progressive. And what is needed is not necessarily, in most cases, and there are exceptions to this, but in most cases, you don't need medication. You do need the protected environment and the facilities in which the processing of the material that's emerging can get facilitated. That it's
Integrated.
and yeah, exactly, integrated. And so if we treat somebody who is having a transpersonal experience pre-rationally, we actually abort the process and stop the good stuff from happening that has the potential to happen. Now, conversely, it's also possible for, woo-woo people to consider any pre-rational experience to be transrational and treat it like that, where the person, like meditate, the last thing somebody in a psychotic episode needs to do is meditate. They need to be, protected and helped with medication. And so it's cheating the person, either somebody actually having a pre-rational to be treated transrationally or transrational to be treated pre-rationally. So it's really important to differentiate between them. Well, the problem, as we started talking about before, is that there can be a lot of similar symptoms because they're both non-rational processes going on. But here are some of the key things to look for. Well, first, let me say the best way to differentiate is to know the outcome, because the outcome of a pre-rational condition, if treated well, is that the person is functioning rationally. The outcome of a transpersonal experience, if treated properly, is psychospiritual growth. And so they're like more connected to the transpersonal domain. So there's a very different outcome, but it doesn't help if somebody comes into my office telling me about what they're experiencing to say, well, we have to wait to find out what happens.
Right.
Look at what's going on right now. So here are some of the key things to look for. The first one is, and I wouldn't say the first, these are all equally important, but the first thing that I look at is, does this person have a history of psychopathology? If they do, there's a greater chance, it's not a guarantee, but a greater chance that what they're experiencing right now is also psychopathology, pre-personal, needs to be treated that way. But that's only one thing. And having a history of psychopathology doesn't guarantee that what you're experiencing right now is psychopathology. It also, if you don't have a history, it doesn't mean that what you're couldn't be psychopathology. Right. There's still those possibilities, but we're looking for tendencies. The second thing is a phenomenon called insight. And in this case, insight means that the client conveys the awareness that what they're experiencing is, in essence, weird. Because if a person's having a transpersonal experience, they almost always will start by saying something like, all right, you're probably going to think this sounds crazy, but, or I know this sounds weird, but, or I've never known of anything like this to happen to anybody, but here's what's happening.
They have an awareness.
That awareness, and I've hardly ever heard a near-death experiencer report their experience without somewhere in the process saying, I know this sounds crazy, but, and it's kind of like, I'm so glad you said that, because, you're just confirming that you've had a transpersonal experience. People who are in psychosis or mental disorder usually do not have insight. Now, I can't say never, but usually do not have insight. They're usually dominated by their symptoms and like especially in psychosis, they they in the psychosis they perceive the hallucinations to be real, and they're plagued by them, because usually psychotic hallucinations are negative. In
Mhm.
and this is actually another of the differentiating features. In psychosis, pre-personal disorders, the experience is usually extremely distressing, and
Mm.
the voices that people hear,
Mhm.
the hallucinations they have are upsetting. Voices telling them to kill themselves, or that they're
Mhm.
worthless, or that
Mhm.
sort of thing. Whereas in transpersonal experiences, the voices tend to be uplifting, positive, helpful, um, emotionally pleasurable,
Mm.
and so we've talked about history, insight, and just to make sure it's clear that the people in pre-personal conditions don't have that distance. They are completely dominated by,
Immerse.
immersed in the experience, right? And they don't have that step back and see what's happening and think, oh, this is strange. Um,
Mhm.
and then the nature of the experiences in psychosis tends to be distressing, in transpersonal tends to be uplifting, but sometimes too uplifting
Mhm.
turns it into an and
Mhm.
then another factor is whether the client who's sitting in front of me can form a therapeutic relationship with me that's characterized by a genuine exchange of information. And so they can say, blah, 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 blah. And I can say, it sounds like what you might be experiencing like something called Kundalini awakening. And if they can say, what's that? And I could say, oh yeah, I mean, it's something not well known in the Western world,
Mhm.
but it's very well known in the Eastern world, and blah, blah, blah.
Mhm.
So there's this exchange. And there's even the what's called mutual empathy. Not only am I understanding what's happening for the client, but they are empathic with me when something happens, like I have to be late for the session. They can be understanding and forgiving, as opposed to thinking that I meant something by,
Mhm.
being late.
Mhm.
Um, so the ability to form a mutually um, empathic and uh, compassionate therapeutic relationship is another feature that indicate, if the person can do that, they're probably in spiritual emergency rather than psychosis. So
Mm.
if you put all those together, if you've got somebody who has no history of psychopathology, they have insight that what they're experiencing is unusual. Their symptoms are, kind of spiritual in nature, and they are. I can feel this, good mutual relationship between us. Almost certainly, the person is in spiritual emergency. I am not going to refer them to a psychiatrist, um, at least not initially, and especially if it may be that their life feels out of control internally and or externally, but I would give us a week or two of trying things to bring life into more control. And if that happens, then we're able to proceed with integrating what's happening, and and they get the positive outcome that there's the potential for. So I've said a lot. Would you like to say something?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, I'm just thinking about the DSM and mental illness, and so what I've theorized is I wonder if psychotic episodes are also spiritual experiences. They're just lower, or perhaps, and it's about, yeah, recognizing, um not to say, hey, not to say that there's not hallucinations and not things that are just from themselves, but maybe they are hearing
Mhm.
spiritual entities that are telling them very dark things. um and
Yeah.
it's about learning to handle that, and then learning to focus on the more positive,
Yeah.
um and not just saying, hey, that's all false or whatever, that's just you, having a mental illness. Because there's a lot of overlap as far as, like, people who claim that they're communicating with spirits, and then that's also a lot of schizophrenia. You're hearing voices. It's like, well,
Yeah.
so
Yeah,
so
yeah,
yeah,
I
what do you think
really
about
agree with what you're saying, that in a generic sense, everything that we experience in life is essentially spiritual, but there might be an explicit spiritual aspect to psychosis, and that needs to be addressed.
that?
The
Hmm.
thing is, you said, that the goal is for the purpose, for the purpose is for the person to learn to kind of like manage that and that sort of
Hmm.
thing. The thing about psychosis is it isn't always possible for the
Mm,
person to get that distance and that,
right.
mastery over what's
Hmm.
happening. And
Hmm.
so there may need to be treatment of the regressive symptoms, with
Hmm.
medication and stuff like
Right.
that.
Hmm.
But absolutely, ultimately, that is the goal for them
Hmm.
to be able to. And there was an interesting, one of my favorite recent books is Bruce Grayson's book After. He is the leading researcher of near-death experiences, and he recently wrote this book after, as the memoir of his career in as a near-death researcher. And one day he was interviewing a young man who had jumped off of a building and to kill himself. And uh, and the and Bruce was asking him, what was happening, what had been happening for him, and what was happening, moment to moment, leading up to his jump. And he said that he heard a voice telling him he was worthless and he
Hmm.
there was no hope and he should just kill himself. So he jumped off the building, and then he said he heard God's voice say, um, "You're my child and you are good and you're going to survive this." And then, of
Mm.
course, he did survive.
Mhm.
And Bruce said to him, how did you know the difference between the psychotic
Mm.
voice and God's
Mhm.
voice? And he said, "You just know." He said,
Mhm.
it's completely different. The quality of it is completely different. That the psychotic voice is um, unrelenting
Mm.
uh, and
Fear and guilt. And
harmful.
mhm.
Yes, yes. And God's voice is gentle and um, reassuring and encouraging. And
Mhm.
he said, there's just no comparison. They're just two
Mm.
totally different things.
Mhm.
So I think that's instructive for those of us trying to understand the differences between
Mm.
these
Mhm.
different kinds of things.
Right. I have someone I know, like, unnamed, who had an awakening, and also very similar sort of me, and was put in psych ward and stuff like that. But he had a very mixed, where it was very uplifting at one moment and then very dark the other moment. And thinking about my own experience, it was very positive in the light side of it, but there were times where I felt kind of like, man, I'm feeling stretched. I'm at the, I'm using a lot of energy, I'm burning a lot of energy, or I'm not sleeping, and I can feel this starting to take a toll a little bit, or I was feeling a little paranoid or getting a little, I was losing sense of reality towards the end. So
Yeah.
what what about those experiences that are more kind of mixed?
Yeah. So, in your case in particular, this is now we move into how does a transpersonally informed counselor work with somebody who's experiencing spiritual emergency? So, I know we're audio here, but if we were visual, it would
Hmm.
be easy for me to show you. So, imagine a horizontal line, and in the middle uh, is a line, a vertical line going up. And at one end of the horizontal line is spiritual repression. And that's where Roberto Assagioli talked about repression of the sublime, where a person's like completely out of touch with spirituality. At the other end, the other extreme of the horizontal line is spiritual emergency, where the person is overwhelmed with spiritual material. In the middle is the place of spiritual emergence, where the
Mm,
material comes in a form and force that is essentially digestible.
mm,
And the vertical line that goes up from there is the potential for spiritual development. It comes out of that middle place. So, with spiritual emergency, one of the first things that needs to be addressed is how to help the person go from that extreme to the middle place, and through what are called grounding techniques.
mm,
So, it would involve like purposely starting to eat regularly and
mhm,
include red meat,
mhm,
because that's very grounding.
mhm,
And like, don't do your vegetarian thing right now, because that puts you
mhm,
over toward the, that extreme.
mhm,
Stop meditating right now, for the time being, not forever, just for now. And then participate in activities that are very grounding, like literally do gardening,
mhm,
like work with the
mhm,
ground,
mhm,
but also, go for a bicycle ride, um, go for a walk, and um, and like watch TV, things that are not going to, upset you,
mhm,
things that take you, essentially take you back to earth, take you
mm,
away from the spiritual domain back to earth. And for most people, in my limited experience, those kinds of grounding strategies help them move back to that moderate place, where then you're not like burning all that energy, and you
mhm.
like threatening to burn out or something.
Right.
Um, and and then gradually introducing more spiritual practices and things like that, as keeps you in that middle ground, where you can keep, stuff keeps coming up, and it can be integrated.
Mhm,
You can, move up that vertical line of spiritual development, because if you're over at that extreme in spiritual emergency, you don't have access to that vertical growth.
mhm.
You're
Right.
stuck in this, extreme
Mhm.
state of overwhelm.
Yeah, right. And in my research and well, my own experience as well is that, oftentimes after these experiences, people go through the dark night of the soul because their paradigm of what reality is has been shattered in their beliefs. And so then it's like, well, what do I believe? What is real? What is going on? And so
Yes.
it's very disorienting. It's like, well, what's my rock to hold on to that I can know? And you you have to do the work and to what was my experience? What did I learn from that? What do other people experience? And um, yeah, or else you just kind of lost. And I was kind of in this lost zone for years because I didn't know to trust that that was a real experience, but my body knew it was, but
Yeah. I know you're like a case study of the kind of thing that just makes me crazy. And that's so such a theme that I've run into is people who, somehow came out of the spiritual emergency, usually through, rougher means than having a knowledgeable counselor, and then go for sometimes years without really acknowledging what happened, what happened and the potential for what happened to be spiritually developmental. And so it's so important. Yeah. And so one of the things we're doing in IANDS right now, so if any of your listeners are mental health professionals who are licensed in the US, who have had actual coursework about transpersonal phenomena, and I'll explain what would qualify as that in a minute, I would encourage them to go to the IANDS website. It's iands.org.
I'll put it in the show notes as well.
Okay, great. And find the application to be listed on our website as a transpersonally competent mental health provider. And we're just now, we've done our first wave of applications. We've just figured out who's approved, and we're about to post the listing for the first time on the website. It'll probably be like actually a week or two from now, but we're going to keep, people can keep applying to be added to the website. And what we're looking for is people who either have an entire degree in transpersonal counseling, like those degrees are offered at places like the California Institute for Integral Studies and Naropa Institute. There might be a couple other places, not many. That's pretty rare to have somebody who has their whole doctorate in transpersonal counseling. Or if they've taken a course in transpersonal counseling. I have taught one at the University of North Texas. I teach it every other year. And a very similar course is taught at William and Mary University. And I'm hoping to be able to offer my course online so anyone anywhere in the US can take it. And so if you've taken a course like that, you qualify. Or if you've been certified by the American Center for the Integration of Spiritually Transformative Experience.
What a mouthful.
Yeah, but the acronym is ACISTE, pronounced assist, because their whole goal is to assist people who've had transpersonal experiences and need to integrate them. And so they have in the past done a certification process. They're not doing it right now. The organization has floundered a little bit, but they're getting their footing again. But in the meantime, anybody who has that certification would qualify for our listing as well. And what we're hoping to happen is that people like you, who at whatever point they realize that what they experienced might have actually been a spiritual emergence or emergency, can go to our website and go to their state, because licensed mental health providers are usually limited to working only in the state where they're licensed. So we're going to organize it by state. So you go to your state, and then you see all the people listed who have passed our screening, and where their primary practice is located. And you can maybe find a place near you, and it also will say if they do telemedicine, meaning that they can really work with anybody in their state via Zoom or confidential.
Yeah. Great. Awesome. Yeah. I think awakenings or spiritual emergency is only going to increase. Just researching about near-death experiences because of our technology. We're able to revive people even after they stop breathing, and so there's a lot more near-death experiences than there used to be. And then I know things like psychedelics can cause these type of experiences, and that's only increasing as well. So
Yep.
interesting
Exactly.
times. Yeah.
Yeah. I couldn't say it better. You just said it perfectly. So true. Yeah.
Mhm. And I don't know if what you think about ETs and that kind of thing. And I know that's in the news too. And then people have spiritual experiences with those kind of things, and they all have to integrate those as well.
That's exactly right. Yeah, Ken Ring wrote a book, The Omega Project, where he
Hmm.
compared near-death experiencers with ET experiencers
Hmm.
and found a lot of similarities.
Right.
And so yeah, I absolutely am on board with ET experiences. I've had clients who've reported them who were, absolutely grounded um,
Hmm.
people, and yeah, so I just know it happens. I don't know exactly what to make of them, but
Hmm.
I'm absolutely sure they happen and they have spiritual implications for people.
Hmm. Hmm.
Sure.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this has all been really good. I really enjoyed it. A lot of great information. I appreciate you.
Great. Oh, my pleasure. Any other questions or any stone that we have left unturned?
Yeah, I feel like I there's a lot to digest. It's hard for me to organize my thoughts now on everything, but
Yeah. Well,
yeah, it's been great.
let me emphasize one other point that I made, but I think may have gotten lost, and that is that sometimes people in spiritual emergency are so overwhelmed by what they're experiencing that even though they have that insight and everything, they just can't get grounded on their own.
Mhm.
And if that's the case, I'm in favor, if they're if their well-being or the well-being of other people isn't in imminent danger, I'm in favor of first trying grounding
Mhm.
techniques to bring them
Mhm.
back to that middle point, and give it a week or two. And if that doesn't happen, then do consider a psychiatric referral
Right.
so that they
Mhm.
can get, whatever protective and medication things
Mhm.
will help them. And what's implicit also in what I said is if there is danger to themselves or other people, then immediately jump to the
Mm.
psychiatric
Right.
referral.
Mhm.
So, but very much, I think in our current climate, there's just immediate jumping to psychiatric
Right. Yeah. I
without,
think that's a part of the conversation, but it's a whole nother thing we could really get into, which probably don't have time for today. But I'm not against medicine. If it's needed, like you said, I think you said it really well. But I would also say, if you are at a point where you're doing well, and you consult with others, that you might be able to get off medicine. It's not something that you necessarily need the rest of your life. It's just I would say medicine is to help with symptoms rather than, it's not a cure.
yes, exactly. Well, I agree with you. I will say that I do know I have had some clients who tried to get off their medication, and after years of being,
Mm.
just stable and
Hmm.
good, and we're like, then, well, maybe you could, and then their
Hmm.
symptoms recur. So
Oh.
I
Hmm.
look on their condition as being kind of the same as like diabetes.
Mm.
If your pancreas doesn't produce insulin, it's just not going to produce insulin,
Mm.
and you got to do insulin for the rest of your
Right.
life. Type 1
Hmm.
diabetes. If your brain is producing chemicals in a unusual way, it's just going to do that, and you need
Hmm.
medication. And that said, I agree with you that I think probably the maybe even a majority of people might be able to go off medication um, once they're stabilized.
Hmm.
And that again, that's another leaning of our current culture, is toward just go on the medication and
Right.
assume that you need it for the rest of your life. And
Hmm.
that, and I think it's absolutely worth doing some experimentation
Hmm.
around that. And
Yeah.
especially when the instigating condition may have been spiritual emergency. It's important to go off medication once you're stabilized, because the medication can actually interfere with
Hmm.
spiritual material coming in and
Hmm.
being integrated. I
Right.
think you mentioned that, like, being on the medication made you feel sort of zombie-like, and
Hmm.
probably did interfere with your connection to
Hmm.
the spiritual domain. And
Hmm.
so, again, there's potential for growth in that connection, and it needs not to be stifled.
Right. I think Jung has a lot to say about, if a man is not connected to the spiritual, then that can cause psychosis and that can cause mental issues. So, I think, we're made to be spiritual beings. And I mean, you don't have to call it spiritual again. And that can be various forms, but that connection to the world and the universe and a force at work for good is very important to the human psyche.
Yeah. Yeah. So well said. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I could just you've got such a joy about you, and it's been great to interact with you. And of course, your knowledge and your experience is very valuable and appreciated.
You're so welcome, Kendall. It's been my pleasure. And I really enjoy especially doing programs like this with interviewers who really get it, and you really get it. Like, you said so many things that I would have said virtually the same way. It just
Mhm.
was really great experience. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yes, ma'am.
All right.